Actually, it's no good. But don't worry.
Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to the Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee hearing on the IRS Taxpayer Authentication Strengthening Security While Ensuring Access hearing. Last year, taxpayers and third parties electronically completed more than 330 million transactions with the IRS. To do so, taxpayers used a number of online tools and applications which offer convenient ways to interact with the IRS. These tools and applications allow taxpayers to make payments to the IRS, check the status of their refunds, and review prior year return information instead of having to call the IRS or visit an IRS office. Sadly, the IRS's online tools and applications have also become an attractive target for criminals looking to steal taxpayer information and commit identity theft fraud. The IRS uses a process known as authentication to separate legitimate taxpayers who want to access the IRS's online services from criminals looking to commit fraud. Unfortunately, given the large amount of personal information on taxpayers available in the public domain, criminals can easily impersonate legitimate taxpayers and pass through the IRS's authentication process undetected. To combat this problem, the IRS needs to ensure the necessary layers of defense are in place when authenticating taxpayers. However, both the Government Accountability Office and the Treasury Inspector General for Taxpayer Administration have raised concerns with how the IRS authenticates users of its online tools and applications. For example, the IRS only required limited authentication of 2 key online applications, even though federal guidelines recommended more robust efforts. Subsequent breaches of these applications in 2015 and 2016 exposed taxpayers to the harm of identity theft. For its part, the IRS has tried to improve its online authentication through multiple efforts. Unfortunately, the IRS has not implemented a comprehensive authentication strategy to coordinate these efforts, even though it has been working on one for nearly 3 years. Without a strategy in place, the IRS will not be able to establish an agency-wide response to improve authentication. Congress also recognizes the importance of establishing secure channels for taxpayers to interact with the IRS online. Last April, the House of Representatives passed the Taxpayer First Act, which establishes a framework for the IRS to develop effective online tools and applications that protect taxpayer information. Today's hearing will focus on the IRS's current online authentication efforts, the challenges the IRS faces when authenticating taxpayers online, and the areas where the IRS can improve its authentication efforts. As criminals continue to evolve and become more sophisticated in their attacks, finding the appropriate solutions for authenticating taxpayers becomes all the more important. The IRS should also consider balancing the appropriate level of authentication while ensuring legitimate taxpayers are able to access online services. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to their testimony. We will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Lewis, when he arrives for the purpose of his opening statement. But with that, I think we will go ahead and hear from our witnesses. Today's witness panel includes 4 experts: Gina Garza, Chief Information Officer at the Internal Revenue Service; Edward Killen, Chief Privacy Officer at the Internal Revenue Service; James McTighe, Director of Tax Issues at the Government Accountability Office; Mike McKinney, Deputy Inspector General for Audit at Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. The subcommittee has received your written statements, and they'll be able to be made part of the formal hearing record. You'll each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening statements. But the ranking member has arrived, and I would love to yield to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Lewis, for purposes of an opening statement. Good morning.
Good morning, Madam Chair. I regret that I'm
No worries.
late.
You're kind of busy. It's a busy week.
Well, we're all a little busy these days, you know? It's a busy time. Good morning, everybody. You're a good-looking group. Yeah, you look very smart, and thank you so much for being here. Madam Chair, since I'm running so late and I don't want to take up time, I will be very brief. I will not read my entire statement. My staff people won't be pleased, but sometimes you cannot please them.
They'll get over it.
Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. I would also like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. Today's hearing will examine how the Internal Revenue Service confirms taxpayers' identities when they use online service. This process is important for reducing identity theft and refund fraud. The growing number of security breaches across the public and private sector often make it difficult for the agency to verify the real taxpayer. In many cases, criminals combine sensitive taxpayer information that they stole from several sources. The thieves use this information to access a taxpayer's online account or file a fraudulent tax return. The impact of these tactics is severe and costly. For an example, criminals stole more than $1.5 billion by filing fraudulent tax refund in 2016. Just last year, the IRS shut down a popular online service that students used to apply for federal financial aid after a breach allowed crooks to access the adjusted gross income of about 100,000 taxpayers. We can do better. We must do better. And with the necessary resources, we will all do better. And again, Madam Chair, thank you for holding this hearing. Look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. Now you're back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis, and without objection, other members' opening statements will be made part of the record. I understand Ms. Garza is here as a supporting role, will be taking our questions, but does not have a formal testimony to offer initially, so we will begin with Mr. Killen. You may begin when you're ready.
Good morning. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Edward Killen, and I am the Chief Privacy Officer of the IRS. With me today is Gina Garza, the IRS's Chief Information Officer. We appreciate the opportunity to testify today. In my role at the IRS, I represent the agency's interests in several areas, including privacy compliance, information protection, records management, disclosure, and data sharing. In addition, approximately 4 months ago, in May 2018, I became responsible for the access and authentication strategy. Testifying with me today is Gina Garza. In Gina's role, she is responsible for all aspects of our systems that operate the nation's tax infrastructure and support the processing of 200 million tax returns annually. We share large aspects of the responsibility for protecting the privacy and security of taxpayer data. We also partner to provide taxpayers and their authorized representatives secure and expanded online access to meet their tax obligations. Our testimony today will reflect that partnership. Protecting taxpayers and their data is not just a job of our offices. It is a foundational priority across the IRS and an extremely important aspect of taxpayer service. The IRS works to protect taxpayers in two primary ways. First, we work continuously to safeguard our computer systems from cyber incidents, intrusions, and attacks. Our systems currently withstand an average of 2.5 million intrusion attempts daily. Some of these attempts are sophisticated in nature or represent advanced, persistent threats. Second, the IRS is waging an ongoing battle to protect taxpayer information. This effort is complicated by the vast amounts of data available to fraudsters from public and private sector breaches outside the tax system. This information can be used to exploit weak authentication protocols and perpetrate all types of fraudulent activity, including tax refund fraud. To address this problem, we are leveraging our Security Summit relationships to develop multi-layered defenses against fraudsters. As a result of the collective efforts, we've been able to reduce the number of tax returns with confirmed identity theft by 57%, with more than $20 billion in taxpayer refunds protected. While we've made significant progress combating tax-related identity theft, we must remain vigilant. Cyber criminals are growing in sophistication, and they are constantly working to find new ways to steal taxpayer data and file fraudulent tax returns. The implementation of appropriate and effective authentication protocols is a key armament in the war against these fraudsters. The IRS took an initial step toward effective protocols when we issued our Identity Assurance Strategy and Roadmap in 2016, a document designed to identify both short and long-term needs to strengthen the IRS's identity assurance posture. To be successful, our strategy requires a three-pronged approach that considers relevant policies, information technology capabilities, and operational needs. We are implementing the strategy, strengthening online authentication protocols, and fortifying our defenses. Another important step was implementing the Secure Access e-authentication system in 2016. This is a rigorous process that helps protect the IRS's online tools in two ways. First, it has a strong identity proofing procedure to establish that first-time users are who they say they are. Second, it requires returning users to go through a two-factor process to authenticate their identity. These are only two of the many important activities in our ongoing work to protect taxpayers from evolving data threats, while meeting increasing taxpayer expectations for online access and tools. We recognize that we have much more work to do, and we are committed to doing that work. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes our joint statement. Gina and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Killen. Mr. McTighe, we will turn to you.
Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the Internal Revenue Service's efforts to improve taxpayer authentication. IRS's mission is to provide taxpayers with quality service and help them meet their tax filing responsibilities. In doing so, it is critically important that it protects sensitive taxpayer information and avoid paying potentially billions of dollars in fraudulent refunds each year. One of the key ways it can do this is through authentication, the process by which it verifies that taxpayers are who they claim to be online, on the phone, through the mail, or in person. My remarks today highlight selected findings of our June 2018 report. In particular, I will describe IRS's efforts to address its authentication challenges, IRS's progress in implementing its authentication strategy, and finally, additional steps that IRS could take to enhance its authentication programs. First, IRS has established organizational structures essential to supporting its taxpayer authentication efforts. Specifically, IRS created the Identity Assurance Office in 2015 to work with stakeholders across the service to mitigate risk in all authentication programs and service delivery channels. In fact, the office cataloged over 100 types of interactions between IRS and taxpayers that require authentication. Based on this and other efforts, in December 2016, IRS released a comprehensive strategy for developing a modern and secure authentication environment that both increases security and improves customer access. IRS has also been collaborating with industry and state partners via the Security Summit to address common authentication challenges. For example, the Security Summit's Authentication Working Group identified key data elements embedded in electronically filed tax returns that have helped provide IRS with greater assurance that a filed tax return is legitimate. Second, although IRS has begun to implement its authentication strategy, it has not prioritized initiatives nor established the resources required to support its strategy, which would be consistent with leading program management practices. We recognize that a strategy is necessarily high level, and IRS must remain flexible and use available resources to respond to unexpected threats. However, if IRS estimated resource requirements and prioritized activities, it would be better able to clarify trade-offs between costs, benefits, and risks of different activities, allowing it to make more informed decisions. Third, given the widespread availability of personally identifiable information, it is essential that IRS continuously strengthen taxpayer authentication to stay ahead of fraudsters without overly burdening taxpayers. As such, we highlight two areas that IRS must address. First, IRS has not yet established detailed plans with timelines and resources needed to fully implement the June 2017 guidelines from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, for secure online authentication. NIST calls for federal agencies to conduct a risk assessment for each component of identity assurance: identity proofing, authentication, and federation. Such an assessment would help ensure IRS that it is selecting the right level of security for each taxpayer interaction. Second, IRS lacks a continuous process for identifying and evaluating potential new authentication approaches, such as possession-based authentication using security key-type devices. Other examples include working with trusted partners such as tax preparers, financial institutions, or other federal or state agencies. And also expanding the functionality of its online account to send taxpayers notifications by text, email, or the IRS To Go app when there is activity on their account, which could help stop fraudsters steal refunds. With this in mind, GAO made 11 recommendations focused on 4 areas. First, it needs to estimate resources for and prioritize its authentication initiatives. Second, it needs to complete risk assessments and improve monitoring of telephone, in-person, and correspondence authentication. Third, it needs to develop a plan to fully implement the new NIST guidance on secure digital authentication. And fourth, IRS needs to implement a process to regularly identify and evaluate potential new authentication approaches. IRS agreed with all 11 of our recommendations and has plans to begin implementing them. Addressing these issues will better position IRS to protect taxpayers and the Treasury. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my prepared remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McKinney. You are recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My testimony today focuses on the IRS's efforts to address electronic authentication on its online applications. Cyber events against the IRS have illustrated that bad actors are continually seeking new ways to attack and exploit IRS systems to steal taxpayer identities and file fraudulent claims for tax refunds. For example, in May 2015, the IRS discovered that criminals used taxpayers' personal identification information obtained from sources outside the IRS to gain unauthorized access to tax information in its Get Transcript application. In March 2017, fraudulent activity caused the IRS to shut down its data retrieval tool on the Department of Education's Student Aid web application. In this case, identity thieves were using individuals' personal information obtained outside the tax system to start the student aid application process and obtain adjusted gross income tax information from the data retrieval tool. The IRS estimated that approximately 100,000 taxpayers were impacted by this data breach. After the Get Transcript breach was discovered, TIGTA assessed the IRS's efforts to authenticate taxpayers' identities when services are provided to taxpayers. TIGTA made recommendations for the IRS to develop a comprehensive strategy related to its authentication processes. The IRS agreed with these recommendations. In February 2018, we reported that the IRS had made progress in improving its electronic authentication controls. For example, the IRS deployed a more rigorous process that provides two-factor authentication via a security code sent to text-enabled mobile phones. However, these improvements were not made to all of its online applications. Our audit also identified that network monitoring tools that the IRS purchased to improve the prevention and detection of automated attacks were not fully implemented due to issues related to resources, incompatibility, and higher priorities. In March 2018, we reported concerns about the transcript delivery system, which allows external third-party customers to view and obtain tax information of both individuals and businesses. We found that processes and procedures to authenticate users do not comply with information security standards. For example, the IRS continued to use single-factor authentication even though its risk assessments in both 2011 and 2015 rated these services as requiring multi-factor authentication to protect taxpayers. TIGTA is currently evaluating whether the IRS has properly implemented secure electronic authentication controls in accordance with the federal standards for public access to IRS online systems. We anticipate issuing a final report in December 2018. One challenge that the IRS faces is complying with the new federal security guidelines. Although the IRS has completed risk assessments for its 52 public-facing applications, it has not completed its risk assessments based on the new NIST guidelines issued in 2017. As a result, the IRS cannot say whether its 52 online applications are at their appropriate levels of authentication assurance. TIGTA has also identified concerns with requests, such as the power of attorney and declaration of representative form received from individuals seeking to represent taxpayers and access taxpayer information. We found that the process is not sufficient to verify that the actual taxpayers submitted or signed the required form to authorize access to their tax information. TIGTA estimates that the IRS may have processed over 1.1 million unauthorized request forms. In conclusion, the IRS will continue to face the ongoing challenge of facilitating expanded access to its online tools for millions of taxpayers while protecting the system from a growing number of sophisticated domestic and international fraudsters. Although improvements in authentication have been made, TIGTA remains concerned about the security of connections to IRS online systems. We plan to provide continuing audit coverage of the IRS's efforts to protect the confidentiality of taxpayer data. Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Thank you. We really appreciate you all being here, appreciate your testimony, and we're now going to proceed to the question and answer session. And I'd like to direct my first question to Mr. Killen. The IRS has said it planned to complete an authentication strategy by the end of 2016. However, in response to GAO's June 2018 report on IRS authentication, the IRS stated that the IRS's assurance strategy and roadmap is only a conceptual document. So what is the current status of the development and implementation of an agency-wide authentication strategy?
Thank you for that question. First, let me say that we appreciate the work done by GAO. We feel as though it was thoughtful, it was deliberative, and so we appreciate the work done in that study. And as was mentioned, we have accepted all the recommendations that were delivered to us pursuant to that audit. With respect to our authentication strategy that was developed in 2016, we have actually begun implementation. There are essentially 14 initiatives within that strategy, 14 capabilities within that strategy that we are seeking to put in place. And so, for example, the Secure Access Platform, which is the platform that we have available for taxpayers who need to authenticate, that is related to the strategy that we have. In addition, we continue to enhance and focus on monitoring of the performance of that system. We have initiated test and learn activities because one of the things that we recognize is that this is a complicated and nuanced space, and so to really continue to evolve and move the needle forward, it's going to take an all of the above approach. So there will be some things that we will be able to do on our own, some things we'll be able to build, some things we will need to engage in strategic partnerships with other federal and private sector entities. And so those are elements within the authentication strategy, and we have initiated test and learn pilots in order to sort of prove out what the marketplace has and what sort of capabilities we can put in place. So as an example, we've partnered with a vendor for identity as a service to help augment our ability inside IRS to authenticate taxpayers. We are engaged right now in a call center authentication study. We have assessed all of our level of assurance levels with respect to the former NIST guidance. Obviously, there's new guidance that has been developed now, but we have engaged in an assessment of that former guidance to try to ensure that for all of the applications that we have that are customer-facing, that they either meet the guidance as is in place or they have mitigated and compensating controls in place because taxpayer data protection is something that's extremely important to us. We are 100% focused on that day in and day out. So although we have work to do on the strategy, because that strategy will be evolving, because this is not something that stops. You have to continually evolve as the fraudsters and the criminals evolve. You have to adapt with them. So I do think that we have begun implementation of various aspects of the strategy. We certainly have work to do. And so we agree with that, and we're committed to doing that work because the GAO recommendations were thoughtful, and we will be pursuing each and every one of those recommendations.
Do you have a timeline in mind for the development and implementation of this strategy?
Yes, ma'am. The timeline, and so it really sort of depends on which aspect of the strategy that we're talking about, but sort of our next step is to, as GAO cited, is to do a cost estimation and prioritization. So what that means is, so the 14 capabilities and initiatives that I mentioned, our next step with that is to lay out a plan for how we will implement, how we will resource against each and every one of those capabilities within our resource constraints. But that is our actual next step. But again, that's a next step with respect to prioritizing all of the capabilities and initiatives that we have. But the work that we are doing day in and day out to protect taxpayers, that work goes on unabated, and it has not stopped. But we are looking to lay out the strategy in a sequenced way so that we will have a longer-term trajectory that we can follow against and that we can resource against as well.
Okay, Mr. McTighe, Mr. McKinney, I'd just like to get your thoughts or views on the IRS's strategy. Can you just briefly tell us what the IRS can do to ensure the successful development and implementation of this strategy?
Chairman, we liked what we saw in the strategy and roadmap. It's critical to have a high-level vision and direction. As Ms. Kleen pointed out there, the strategy was pretty detailed in terms of having 6 core objectives, 10 strategic efforts, the 14 initiatives that were mentioned, and 90 activities supporting those initiatives. What GAO's concern has been is that that's a lot of work, a lot of activities. How much will it cost? What should come first? And what are the trade-offs among those activities? And the more information, the more analysis that can support decisions on what to do next and developing the timelines that you're inquiring about, we think that would further strengthen IRS's approach to improving authentication efforts.
Mr. McKinney?
From our standpoint, we're currently looking at that, and one of the concerns, the main concerns that we have is in terms of making sure that they have a full inventory of all the ways taxpayers can access either input information or get information from the IRS, and do a proper risk assessment of those. And once they do that risk assessment, put those at their proper level of authentication. And that's something we're looking at, right now, and then we'll be issuing a report. But those are our main areas of focus, is to make sure they have a complete understanding of all the ways taxpayers can get in and have that assessed.
Okay, back to Mr. Killen. Does the IRS have plans on how they will measure the progress of the implementation and progress of the strategy?
I think that is so. Do we have concrete measurables that are in place right now today? I think the most accurate answer to that is no, because that is not. We're not quite at that point yet. But I think there are some direct indicators, obviously, that we need to develop. But I also think this is an area where indirect indicators will be important as well. And so what I mean by that is, so obviously the world in the space of authentication is very large, it's very broad, because for us in IRS, what that really comes down to is all of the various transactions that taxpayers conduct with us, because essentially each time a taxpayer is interacting with us to fulfill their tax obligations, for the most part, if they're requesting data, that is data that requires some form of authentication. It's just a matter of what is the level of rigor mapped against the sensitivity of the data that they're seeking at that particular time. So there may be one level of rigor associated with, making a payment with us. There may be yet another level of rigor associated with if you need a transcript. So my point to that is that assessing measures against each and every one of those transactions is something that's probably not practical. However, I think what we need to do is think about it from the macro standpoint. So one of the things that we're interested in is, for example, what is the accessibility of IRS taxpayers to be able to access our systems? What are the numbers of taxpayers who, as they attempt to access our applications that are online, what's the success rate of taxpayers who are able to effectively verify and validate and actually gain access to their information versus those taxpayers who maybe could not get into our systems because either they didn't possess the information that was needed in order for them to be able to effectively authenticate, or in the case of more fraudulent activities by criminals, what are the characteristics of that interaction so that we can use that as an opportunity to further refine our defenses. So I think my broader point is that we do need to look at what will be the measurables around that. I think we've got good measures with respect to how we're combating fraud, but that's really on the back end. So I think we have work to do with continuing to refine the measures of how are our authentication protocols working holistically, sort of looking at it from end to end. So I think we've got some work to do in that regard. And again, we're committed to doing that work.
Okay. Mr. Killen or Ms. Garza, if you're so inclined, can you, either one of you, briefly discuss how the IRS balances providing the appropriate level of security for its online tool and applications while ensuring legitimate taxpayers are able to access those when needed?
So I'll give us a start with that, and Ms. Garza can jump in. I think from our perspective, balance is something that I don't think that's the right terminology and the right way we want to think about it, because we really want to think about it as a commitment to both. We're absolutely committed to taxpayer security and protecting taxpayers' data, but we're also committed to providing taxpayers with tools and channels in which they can interact with us to fulfill their tax obligations. So I think what that really means for us is, pursuant to our strategy, we have to ensure that taxpayer information is protected, but we have to also provide for other channels for our taxpayers to interact with us that are rigorous as well, but that allow different opportunities for them to interact with us. So we're really committed to both, and actually, from an authentication perspective, you have to be committed to both, because essentially, if the rigor of your authentication process does not allow a taxpayer to interact with you, that does not mean that we have the luxury to not service them. So we still have to have a way to service those taxpayers that still equally ensures that their data is protected. So we're focused on security day in and day out, but we also have to be focused on providing taxpayers with access, because at the end of the day, they're attempting to fulfill their obligations, and so we have to equip them to be able to do that.
So I would echo what Mr. Killian said. Protecting taxpayer data is paramount. I think we would all agree with that. But I do believe that we have an obligation to try to provide access to taxpayers. And this is where we're looking at technology to see if there is a way for us to be able to provide the services that people deserve while still maintaining the integrity of our systems and keeping our data secure. So we're looking at it. We haven't found a silver bullet yet, but we are, there's I think either GAO or TIGTA mentioned that we had just put out something where you can use your iPhone, IRS to Go, and get an authentication token that you can use. So we're looking at different technologies that will help people authenticate through our system.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, the Honorable Mr. Lewis, for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question for each one of you. How have the recent breaches in both public and private industry impacted the agency's ability to detect and fight identity theft?
I'll start with that. Actually, when we heard about all of the different breaches, I was very concerned. I was very concerned with how much data was out there and how that data could be used against us. And that's actually why we launched the effort about 1.5 years ago of reviewing every single transaction that we have with taxpayers of all of our online systems. So we went through, did a very detailed analysis to identify what data was needed in order to be able to get access and what kind of authentication procedures or protocols we needed to have in place for all of those applications. So we went through and did that and basically fortified and secured our online applications. While we were doing that, the new NIST guidelines came out, and so we actually augmented some of our secure access solutions so that we would be able to be ready for when the 63.3 actually came out, because we started to work on this before it actually came out. And so It is very concerning that all of that data is out there, and this is where we are continually talking to our stakeholders with other agencies to come up with ideas and ways to fortify our defenses.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Lewis. I would echo everything that Ms. Garza said, but I would also just say it's very concerning because the proliferation of personally identifiable information that is out in the ecosystem makes it fundamentally more difficult to authenticate an individual because, you know, from a simplistic way of stating it, often they have the same information that the legitimate individual has. So what that means is that we have to be constantly vigilant and we have to continue to evolve. This is not a static issue. It's an issue that's going to continue to morph and change, and so we have to try to be flexible to change with it. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to data elements. What data elements do the fraudsters have who are attempting to impersonate the legitimate individual, and how do we discern who is who? And so what that means is we have to continually first be aware of what sort of exposures have been out there, what sort of information do the criminals have access to, and then we have to factor that into how do we adapt our defenses accordingly. And so we have to be able to change our authentication protocols, and so, you know, that commitment to security and access, that's where the tension comes into play there, because as those data elements become more and more exposed, we have to make our authentication protocols more rigorous. And if we don't get that dial exactly right, what ends up happening is legitimate taxpayers can't get through and they don't have the ability to interact with us. So we just have to pay constant attention to it. And I think, as Ms. Garza stated, you know, this is one where I think everybody is struggling with this dynamic, whether you're in the public or private sector, especially with a customer base our size, 100 or so million taxpayers of all walks of life. So what that means is we're going to have to take an all of the above approach. There will not be one silver bullet. There'll be some things we can do on our own unilaterally, but in many instances we'll need to partner with folks both in the public sector and in the private sector, as Ms. Garza stated, to help us work through this. And so I think this will have to be a collective effort to get in front of this.
Care to respond?
I would just underscore the point that Mr. Killeen made, and I also made in my statement in terms of how important it is for IRS to continually evaluate, look at, and test alternatives, evolving technologies and approaches to authenticating taxpayers. Experts that we've spoken with suggest that maybe a one-size-fits-all approach isn't necessarily the best way. You know, we want to be able to ensure a balance between keeping the fraudsters out but allowing the legitimate taxpayers in. And so there may be opportunities to, you know, for example, use a federated model, which would allow credentials established by a tax preparer or a financial institution or another federal agency such as Social Security or the VA to be used to access IRS systems. Obviously, a lot of work has to be done to ensure, you know, the security of that type of approach, but there are other approaches that could be considered and should be considered as fraudsters become more clever and look for opportunities. One last point is we're speaking a lot about online authentication, but we don't want to overlook the other channels of in-person, telephone, and correspondence, because when data breaches occur, we've seen a couple examples. Those are the default ways that taxpayers can still receive service, and it's very important to keep monitoring those channels and measure the performance to ensure those are operating effectively as well.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, will you just yield Mr. McKinney, let him have an opportunity
Certainly.
to respond. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Some of the points made are exactly what we'd say, and especially comes into play where they try to implement fraud filters for returns coming in, and that's why they need so many filters, the 200 plus filters that they have. It makes it harder to fine tune those. They have more false positives because people can make themselves look a lot like taxpayers. And once a fraudster has that kind of data, they constantly try to get more data by seeing how far they can get through the system. So it becomes highly problematic in trying to identify who's legitimate and who's not.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I recognize Ms. Walorski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Garza, I'm concerned about our February 2018 report by TIGTA that said the IRS had purchased but not fully implemented network monitoring tools to prevent and detect cyber attacks. What's the current status of the contractor services and technology tools the IRS acquired but, according to the TIGTA report, has not fully implemented, and when do you anticipate they be fully implemented?
So as of the end of this month, we will be 97% complete across all of the online applications. The couple of applications that are still left, we're working through some situations where it may impact the taxpayer, and so we're trying to discuss how to minimize the impact to taxpayers. But I'm happy to report that 97% of our applications have been, we've expanded our monitoring tools to just about everything.
And you expect that to be fully implemented and when?
So, like I said, we're talking to some of our business customers to understand how we might, what we need to do. It's not a question of, do we have the technology? Obviously, we have it. It's a question of, when do we turn it on, and what is the impact to our external stakeholders once we turn it on?
Great, thank you. Mr. McKinney, TIGTA raised concerns in 2016 regarding the IRS's ability to detect automated cyber attacks. You made 7 recommendations to the IRS Chief Information Officer, including clarifying IRS and contractor responsibilities, monitoring results of controls put in place, and providing adequate tools and training. The IRS agreed with all the recommendations. Can you give us an update on this? Has IRS implemented all of the recommendations, or are there still areas for improvement?
I think they're making progress on all those recommendations, and we're doing some additional work to evaluate where they're at on that. But they did agree, and I think they're certainly making progress in that area.
It also seems useful that the IRS would fully analyze data captured by its online tools and applications to identify suspicious activity and system weaknesses. However, TIGTA has reported on numerous occasions that the IRS does not analyze its audit logs correctly. Mr. McKinney, again, can you talk about the concerns TIGTA has about the IRS's lack of adequate review of audit logs, and why is that so important to monitor audit logs?
The people who commit fraud, if you look at the audit logs, you start seeing patterns of activity where they're trying to get through the system. If those logs are not formatted in a way that makes them easy to analyze, and analyzed consistently, and the criteria needs to be modified so that they know where the monitoring needs to take place, then those fraudsters they can go in there undetected. That's the problem. Once fraudsters can operate undetected for a while, they can do a lot of damage. So the ability to monitor that activity within the network is really critical.
And just one more quick question, Ms. Garza, why isn't the IRS properly reviewing, analyzing, and distributing its auto logs?
So, one, we've been working very closely with TIGTA on this finding. We have to refine our triggers. What we found based on that audit was that we were doing it on the front end, but we were not doing it on the back end. So we have stood up, we have now 2 teams doing the cyber analytics team, looking through those logs. We have identified, refined our triggers. We have identified data elements that TIGTA had recommended to us and have included those. And right now we're in the process of evaluating the new reports to make sure that they're giving us the kind of results that we're working with. And we really thank TIGTA for their help and support in getting this done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Del Bene, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of you for being with us today. Mr. Killen, with respect to the IRS's efforts to meet the 2017 NIST standards, you had mentioned that commercially available solutions that meet these new, more stringent authentication requirements are not widely available today. Do you have a sense when solutions might be available, and when they are, what resources, whether it's budget or other resources, it might take to accommodate those?
I think this might be another one where maybe we can sort of tag team the answer.
That's fine.
But I'll just say that I think this is another aspect where the considerations are sort of nuanced also, because when you look at the new standards, and those are the NIST 863 standards that were released last year, identity proofing has been separated from authentication. And so when you talk in terms of identity proofing, it really is a product of what evidence are you collecting, and then who has the ability to actually validate the authenticity of that data collected. So whether it be driver's license or passports or some other sort of information, what technology, what entity has the ability to validate the authenticity of that data, and then secondly, to match that data that has been authenticated back to the individual who's trying to conduct business with us. So what that means from a technological availability standpoint, I won't say that there's not technology available. I think one of the considerations, and there are many, is it available at scale for the number of customers that we had, and is it available with sufficient redundancy so that you are not tied or locked into one technology, one vendor, one solution that would put you in a place of concern if something happened with that technology or solution. But I'll defer to Ms. Garza.
Yeah, so let me add a couple of things. One, to the last point that Mr. Killian was talking about. There's also a question about certification. Who certifies that this publicly available product actually meets the standard? And so there are some conversations that we're having with GSA and with SSA and with the Treasury Department about what that process is going to look like, so that we don't want to just go out and get any solution. We want to get a solution that is actually certified that it's going to work against the new NIST standards. Having said that, overall, like Mr. Killian said, they've separated the ID proofing component with the authentication component. Our solution today meets the authentication component of the new NIST standards. We've also have implemented, there's a whole new risk assessment approach that we needed to make sure that we did to evaluate it against the new standards. We've completed that work, we've piloted that work, and we anticipate we'll evaluate every single one of our online applications in a year's time. In the meantime, we'll be working to determine, we are working with SSA and GSA and others to try to find a solution that would meet the requirement around the ID proofing component.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mateague, the IRS, we've been talking about their efforts to meet the 2017 NIST guidance, but that guidance applies to the entire federal government. And so I wondered, what's your view of how other agencies are handling this? And is the IRS kind of on track with others? Is there a difference or best practices that you can talk about?
Actually, Madam Congressman, we have work underway looking at a few select agencies across the government to see what they're doing, the progress they're making, and the steps that they're following to implement the 2017 guidance. We hope to have a report out, I think, early spring, maybe the February timeframe. So we're looking at it. It's a little bit too early to say.
But that would give us a sense of how some folks are maybe found some solutions that could be shared in other agencies and how to use those.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Winstrup, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm not sure who can answer this question, Esther, if anybody, but certainly we're not the only industrialized country that collects taxes, and that we're probably not the only country that's been subject to fraud and security challenges. So I'm just wondering how we compare to other nations, and are we looking at that to find best practices to prevent fraud and increase security?
So I'll take that. Actually, we have met with other countries, in particular with Europe, England, United Kingdom, sorry, lost that for a while. And we actually brought an individual in who had expertise in this area to advise actually my entire team on the techniques that they are using in order to combat, because you're right, they have the same issues that we have. And so we took some pointers from him as to what the solution is. They're using different kinds of techniques. A lot of it has to do with they're using, like France is using tokens of some kind. We're looking at facial recognition as another possibility. And so we have had some conversations with other countries, but the ID proofing part is the hard part of this. Everyone is solving for the authentication piece, but the ability to ensure that the person that you're talking, the taxpayer, is who they say they are, that's the part where people seem to be having a hard time finding. And that's why we're having a hard time finding a solution for the ID proofing part.
Yeah, I think that there may be some real value in entertaining conversations with other governments, agencies, because a lot of this fraud is not domestic. You know, it's coming out of Nigeria and everywhere else, right? So I don't think they really care if they steal dollars or pounds. And so we may be able to share information in ways that we can stop some of these things in their tracks if we're collaborating on finding where it's coming from and how they're doing it. So it may suggest that we do more of that and also come up with best practices, but see, we've got common enemies in this regard.
Yeah. We did have a study. We asked one of our vendors to look at other countries, and they provided us with a kind of a high-level summary, but we will continue to do that.
Mr. McTeague.
Congressman, I would underscore, I think that's a very important place to look, but I would also reiterate what IRS is doing with the Security Summit. You know, some of our states are bigger than, have bigger economies than many other countries. And so, I think the Security Summit is a mechanism that is working well and has the potential to generate additional results. In the work that we did in our June 2018 report, we did go out to some states. Other countries were outside the scope, but states are facing similar problems. They are looking at different technologies, some utilizing driver's license information, pictures. Gina mentioned facial recognition technology. So, I mean, there are ideas out there. And again, this underscores the importance of looking broadly and continuously at developing technologies and approaches.
I appreciate that approach. Yeah, Mr. Killen.
I'll echo both of those comments. This is an area where no one has a monopoly on the best ideas, and so we're open for great ideas wherever they come from. The Security Summit, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, because that, in many ways, I think has been transformative for us, because, protecting taxpayers is in the interest of everyone within the tax ecosystem, and so, we realized several years ago that this was a job that was too big for everyone to continue to operate in their individual silos, whether it was IRS or whether it was the State Departments of Revenue or the private sector tax industry. And so, as an example, one of the aspects that I think we've made some tremendous progress on, really two. The first is we have an authentication working group within the Security Summit. And so one of the things they have been working on are what we would call trusted customer requirements, because, to the extent that you can stop this problem on the front end, it protects taxpayers on the back end, so you don't have folks burdened. And then we have a group that has been focused on working with the states and the industry to all align on common security standards and share emerging threats and trends from a cybersecurity perspective, so everyone can harden their defenses.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mr. Bishop, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to the panel today. I appreciate your being here today. In Mr. McKinney's prepared statement, I noticed that there was a rather alarming statistic that the IRS has 52 forward-facing applications. And I get the idea of access to taxpayers. I think that's a great idea. But it seems to me that as we discuss privacy and record management and cybersecurity of all the taxpayer data, it seems to me that that many forward-facing portals is a disaster waiting to happen. And I'm just wondering what the purpose of the 52 forward-facing applications are, and if in fact that's an issue for the IRS, and if there's a concern that maybe we want to a more focused approach to the way in which we provide access to data for taxpayers?
Well, I can start and let Ms. Garza or others even come in. So we have 100 to 120 million taxpayers, all with needs to conduct business and transactions with IRS, whether it be for individual taxpayers or whether it be small businesses, whether it be representatives who are authorized to do business on behalf of their taxpayers. And so I won't say that I have a true understanding of what each and every one of those applications do. I think, you know, your question's an insightful one. I would just say that I think each application that we have is there because some taxpayers somewhere, some group of taxpayers find great value in it. But I think, you know, obviously it's important for us to always assess whether there's a true business need for applications and services that we provide. Application essentially is a service to a taxpayer in some way, shape, or form, whether it's for a taxpayer to get a transcript, to make a payment with us, to check their account. So I would just say, so I appreciate the essence of the point, and that is you have so many taxpayer public-facing, you know, applications that, you know, there could be a perspective that could increase the risk. I think the challenge there is inherently we are a public-facing organization because taxpayers have to adhere to their tax requirements, and so we work to try to make it as easy for them to be compliant with their tax obligations as we can, but we'll...
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Garza?
The only thing that I would add to that, so there are 52 online transactions where we exchange information with the taxpayer. Part of our strategy is to move all of those applications that we can behind our secure access solution. And for our highest risk applications, we've done that. So the ones that were at the highest risk might have been providing more PII information. Those have been moved behind that. But then there's other kinds of applications like make a payment. Most fraudsters are not going to go and try to make a payment to the IRS. So I think I understand the concern. I think what we've done is that we've consolidated the protection layer that we're using and put our most sensitive applications behind that layer.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Dr.
I would just like to add that we currently have work undergoing looking at the suite of online services that IRS offers and, you know, whether or not that makes sense. So hopefully we'll answer some of your questions.
That's a huge question, and we have a limited amount of time. I'm sorry that I didn't, we don't have more time to talk about it, but I'd like, if you want to talk more about it, I'd love to hear about it. Dr. Wenstrup mentioned today that he thinks that you should review what other countries are doing. I think that's a great idea. I also think that when it comes to developing this implementing online multi-factor authentication, that the idea of getting the private sector involved is a really important process, and I'm very glad to hear that the summit has produced that kind of working relationship. I hope that continues. One other concern I had, and it's a limited amount of time, is to ask Mr. McKinney, the taxpayers can grant power of attorney to get information, and you've raised some concerns in your written testimony that there may not be protections in place for these forms that are used. And I wondered if you might be able to comment that real quickly.
Right, and that came as a result of the IRS evaluating that and taxpayers being completely unaware that they had a representative authorized to look at their account. And when you project it out, it's pretty serious. It's over 1.1 million when you project how many people this might affect. In the future, the IRS is a mitigating control, which is some benefit, is going to send a notification to the taxpayer to confirm that they have authorized that. So I think that's a mitigating control until they can put some online process in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sherman.
Mr. Corbello, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, thank you for this hearing, and I'm grateful to all the witnesses. For me and for my community in South Florida, this is an issue of major concern. Sadly, South Florida is known for seeing a disproportionate share of fraudulent activity, whether it be tax fraud, Medicare fraud, insurance fraud. And it's something that our community wants to fight, and our community wants to see progress on all these fronts because, of course, when people defraud the government, they're defrauding the public, fellow taxpayers. So I'm grateful for this opportunity, and a lot of my questions have been answered in previous exchanges. But I think all of us agree that technology is probably the cure to a lot of these challenges that we face. So I just wanted to ask broadly if the agency is at all looking forward at technologies such as blockchain that in the future could make all of these transactions a lot safer, in the view of many, at least for now, completely secure with zero risk. Is that something that's on the agency's radar? I'll let anyone answer.
So yes, we've been looking at blockchain. We have met actually with several vendors with that offering. We've explored the possibilities. Here again, it's not a complete solution. The part that most of these solutions keeps missing is the making sure before you set up the blockchain, that kind of security control, you have to already have known that the person is who they say they are. That's the part that has been very hard to solve. Blockchain will work. You're correct. It's very good. But if you're blockchaining the wrong person, then it didn't help. So that's what we're trying to work through, and that's where we're trying to explore for new solutions around the ID proofing component.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you, and again, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. And with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.